Are Ferrari in trouble? Hello and welcome back to the Downforce Diary. So today we're going to be unpacking the Canadian Grand Prix and Ferrari's performance. So this weekend in Canada saw Max Verstappen return to the top spot, followed by a strong Lando Norris and a strong George Russell. Both the McLaren and the Mercedes performed quite well this weekend, and it is something that I do want to dive a little bit deeper into, probably in a different video to this, because I want to put the focus on Ferrari. For today we had a double DNF out in Canada, a double Q2 exit after a double podium in Monaco last time out. Now historically for Ferrari, Canada isn't necessarily a bad track. Last year we had a P4 and a P5, the year before that we had a podium with a P2 for Carlos Sainz. So the question really is here, what went wrong? Now, I've seen a lot of people really question the performance of the Ferraris coming off the back of arguably their strongest weekend in Monaco, especially since there are definitely some similarities between Canada and Monaco in terms of track characteristics and track configuration. Both tracks boast things like tricky low-speed corners and are fairly narrow in terms of overtake, so based on this, people definitely would have had that expectation that Ferrari would have thrived here. But based on track alone, there are a couple of things that do differentiate Canada from Monaco, especially this weekend, and are things that unfortunately came to bite Ferrari in the hind end. So first and foremost, the conditions out in Canada this weekend were far from favourable. The weather in particular had a huge impact on everyone's race, not just Ferrari's, but in reference to them we saw poor grip, slipping, sliding, just not being able to optimise their potential, and importantly not being able to exploit those upgrades they brought. And these upgrades were supposed to help with firing up the tyres and getting more speed on the straight, so definitely weren't able to optimise this coming into this weekend as a result of the conditions that they were facing. Now in terms of setup for this weekend, Ferrari, like many other teams, went for a more loaded rear wing, which is very important for downforce and braking efficiency, and we did see that in both the drivers when they were saying that they actually did have pace, especially going through the corners. Overall their pace in the first part of the race wasn't actually that bad, and I'll get onto that in a bit, but talking about corners specifically, their pace through corners was actually pretty good. It was more so the conditions on track causing that poor grip and making the race quite difficult to handle. Now thinking about those low speed corners, and well, it's something that we really saw Ferrari thriving in Monaco, and it's something that we know to be a real strong point on the SF24. It just couldn't be exploited this weekend, let's say, as a result of lack of grip, and then with the car also struggling on straights more generally because of some shifts in the car in comparison to last year's car. And then we look at things again like the weather and some of the engine issues. It was a lose-lose for Ferrari this weekend. So talking about qualifying, because in this analysis I can't really speak too much on Friday. It was a bit of a, I don't know, it was a bit of a write-off considering the conditions that we had, and even looking at FP3 on the Saturday, it wasn't completely representative. For example, we had Carlos Sainz. He looked quickest on the long runs, quicker on those longer stints, but there were so many different variables, different fuel loads, things like that, that you couldn't have really used this to indicate race pace overall. The only thing you could kind of take from this is that Ferrari had a decent race pace in general, but you couldn't really put that in comparison to the other cars because no one was really running a representative session, to be totally honest. That said, Carlos's race pace in particular wasn't too bad, and I will get onto that a little bit later. But qualifying was really the first time where we started to see those difficulties pop up for Ferrari with that double Q2 exit, and it wasn't necessarily through the car itself, it was more strategy and tyres that really caused this. Do I think they would have gotten pole or really close to those front areas on the grid? No, not necessarily. The pace of the car, while it was there, it wasn't amazing. It definitely wasn't what it was in Monaco, but into Q3 I certainly think they could have gotten there if they didn't go with the tyres that they did when they did. It wasn't, I don't think it was so much the fact that they went on the U-softs, I think it was when they went on the U-softs, and in comparison to everyone else's, it was just poor strategy. I can understand why they timed it the way they did, especially with the conditions changing so much, not knowing when they were going to get certain runs, things like red flags and stuff like that coming into play. But for a team who didn't have the strongest pace this weekend, this was a major risk, and it just didn't pay off at all. Now, looking at race performance, starting with Leclerc specifically, the pace in the first stint actually wasn't all that bad. As I've mentioned a few times, it definitely wasn't on the level of the McLarens and the Mercedes this weekend. They were really, really good. It was definitely decent enough to compete at least in the points range, which is key for Ferrari at the minute. Obviously with McLaren getting incredibly closer now in the constructors, these are things they need to really be hanging on to, especially for Charles Leclerc, with him, to be honest, getting within a decent range of Max Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship. Do I think he'll overtake him? No, but at least within a challenge. So this was quite an important race for him. But unfortunately for Leclerc, it was just a little bit cursed. So when it was raining, the drivers were really fighting with the track conditions. And then when it dried up, of course, Leclerc had the engine issues to deal with. Now, looking to the timings, this was causing him to lose around about a second on the straights altogether. And then in comparison, his fastest lap with those engine issues and using DRS was around 306 kilometers an hour. Once this was tweaked, without DRS, it was around 308 kilometers an hour. So there was a huge disparity, huge impact there on his race pace. Then, of course, after this has been dealt with, we saw the dreaded Ferrari tyre strategy come into play. That said, I don't think the strategy has actually been that bad at all this year in comparison to previous years, the last 2 years in particular, but it was definitely poor yesterday. Putting the slicks on a wet track, I don't work for the team. I'm not going to speak on that, but I think Ferrari were definitely in a let's experiment mode. I think they kind of thought, oh, we've got nothing to lose, you know, we're kind of hanging out in the sort of bottom half, not bottom half, but like the not points part of the table. That said, I do think with a better strategy, they definitely could have been competing for points. But yeah, that engine issue really didn't help matters. He lost too much time, unfortunately, ended up in a retirement. And yeah, just a combination of poor conditions, not being able to optimise the car's strength, especially in those low speed corners, engine issues, and just shoddy strategy came to bite Leclerc here. Now, when we look at Carlos Sainz in comparison, he actually wasn't having that bad of a race overall, and his pace was definitely getting better and better as the track was drying up. There was definitely a certain potential for points. I was keeping an eye on him just before the DNF actually, in that when he was just starting to break back into those points positions, and I think he definitely could have taken a few more off, maybe ended up around the P7, P6 mark in the end. But yeah, that being said, not too bad. The race pace wasn't too bad, and he'd even said that across the weekend. But yeah, unfortunately the track conditions just got the better of him, catching him out, and a driver error led to that double DNF. In the end, his car was not strong enough today on the one hand, but obviously with that mistake he could have been fighting for the points. So, you know, it's just one of those things. All things considered, I don't see this being a huge issue for Ferrari moving forward. I think conditions played a huge part this weekend in the issues, especially with them not being able to optimise those upgrades that they brought in, especially looking at things like tyre management, being able to warm up those tyres. The colder conditions really just didn't help out Ferrari this weekend. They do better in those warmer conditions, those warmer tracks. Mercedes, for example, do thrive better in those colder tracks, and that's why we probably saw a really good performance from Mercedes, especially from a tyre management perspective. But yeah, all in all, that it really didn't help them, and also in terms of like grip and stuff like that in those lower speed corners where they normally do better, they didn't have it there this weekend. I think that Barcelona will be a lot more representative of any progress they've made, especially in terms of upgrades. Looking to tyres again, it'll be a lot easier to fire them up there. I think Mercedes could potentially struggle with that aspect of the race. In terms of the engine issue, it'll just be a matter of having a look, fixing it. It's a reliability issue, so at the end of the day, it is something that should be able to be fixed. I don't imagine it's going to be something that causes too much long-term issue. They've got a few weeks now, they've got a bit of a gap, so I'm not worried. The drivers don't appear worried. No one should be worried yet. I think when we get to Barcelona, if we continue to see these issues there in a slightly different track with different setup, different challenges being faced, then we have something to worry about. But until then, I think we're doing okay. So yeah, all in all, that was Ferrari's race weekend kind of explained and broken down. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. But that is all for today's episode. I might do a separate episode on McLaren and Mercedes because I'm quite interested in that. But yeah, that is it for today.